Okay, and we're recording. We're live, so here we go. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Probably about number 20 of my webinar interviews. Once again, I have a great guest lined up today, and that's fantastic. I want to begin though with a Hail Mary, and then we'll get into an introduction of our guest. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. I guess that's appropriate today. Did Pope Francis already do the consecration, the Fatima consecration today, or is that later on? I think it's already done.
Yeah, I think it's done.
Yeah, I think it's already done. But anyway, our guest today is Dr. William Cavanaugh. Before I introduce him, I think I've met you maybe twice in my life. Once you actually came to and spoke at a conference that I organized in Allentown, associated with the Sales University. It was a conference on Font Balthasar, and the Schindlers were there and the whole Communio crowd. But you gave a fantastic talk, and I didn't know who you were, really, up until that point. You were suggested to me by the Schindlers to come and speak. And but then after that point, I really started following your career because I really resonated with everything that you said there. And your books on various topics are just, I love them because they agree with me, or maybe it's the other way around. And so I think they're genius because they confirm my own biases. But anyway, I'm going to give a very short bio here. Dr. Cavanaugh, William Cavanaugh, is director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology and professor of Catholic Studies at DePaul University. His other books, we're going to be looking at Field Hospital today, other books, because I'm reading the blurb on the back. Field Hospital is one of his latest books, and a book that I highly recommend to everybody. I love it. But some of his other books included Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire, and then the other book, The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology, and the Roots of Modern Conflict. There's another book of yours I read years ago. What was the title of that book? It's back here somewhere, I think. Eucharist and Torture. Was that the name of the...
Torture and Eucharist, yeah.
Torture and Eucharist. I got it turned around. Torture and Eucharist. And oh boy, I devoured that one. I thought that was great. But we're going to be looking at Field Hospital. Obviously, the title is, I assume, drawn from, sort of draws its inspiration from Pope Francis's analogy of the church as a field hospital. Dr. Cavanaugh writes a lot on theopolitics, the church and politics, the history of the relationship between religion, politics, violence, those sorts of things. And so one of the things I'm going to begin with here is that there was a very famous article that you wrote a long time ago that really, I think, it really moved my needle, I'll tell you that. And it was called A Fire Strong Enough to Consume the House. Now, what journal was that article in? Remind me.
It was in Modern Theology. I actually wrote
That's
it
right.
as a term paper in grad school.
Oh, wow. That shows what a wunderkind you must have been in grad school, that you're already writing at such a high level. That's fantastic. But I highly recommend that people find it, because in that article, what Dr. Cavanaugh, I think, shows quite clearly is that the sort of founding myth of origin of the Enlightenment, which is a kind of myth of original violence, essentially says that the modern state, in its secularity, or at least its religious indifference, is justified on the grounds that religions clearly cause wars, and did cause wars in the European theater, which is why the state had to step in to keep the peace. So let's begin there, Dr. Cavanaugh, because it's kind of become one of your signature sort of things where you write on this myth of religious violence. So why don't you just sort of riff on that for a while and take it wherever you want?
Sure. Yeah, so we were, first of all, thanks, Larry, for having me on the show. You're one of my heroes as well, not least because you have abandoned the world of academia to start a Catholic worker farm, and that's what I do in my daydreams when I'm sitting in meetings. I think I want to be Larry Chapp. So,
well, at least that makes one person that wants to be Larry Chapp. But thank you for that. I appreciate that. So go ahead. What is this myth of religious violence?
Yeah, so this was actually, it came out of a political science class I was taking in grad school where we were reading Richard Rorty and John Rawls and Judah Sklar and some other people, and they were all kind of making reference to this idea that the wars of religion is what spawned liberalism, that, Catholics and Protestants started killing one another, and so the state had to step in and keep the peace. And so I decided to kind of do some digging, and it didn't take a whole lot of digging to figure out that, uh, Catholics killed Catholics and Protestants killed Protestants, and Catholics and Protestants collaborated in the so-called wars of religion. So that the second half of the 30 Years' War was basically between France and the Habsburgs, the kind of two great Catholic dynasties of Europe. And France was, Cardinal Richelieu was in league with the Protestant Swedes and so on. So you begin to think about this and think, okay, there's something going on here. So what I began to look at then was, what do you mean by religion? How is this being defined? How are these wars of religion, if it's in many respects Catholics versus Catholics and so on? And so I began to look at these genealogies of where the term religion came from, and it kind of takes on its modern form in the same period as these wars were going on. And so in the Middle Ages, you've got the distinction between religious and secular is the distinction between two different kinds of clergy. Religious clergy belong to the religious orders, and secular clergy belong to the dioceses and so on. But it doesn't mean anything like what it comes to mean in the same era. And so I began to suspect that that the distinction between religion and secular was a result of these wars. And so it's an anachronism to say that they were caused by religion. This is not to say that the violence didn't happen, or Christians weren't at fault. I mean, obviously they were all Christians and they were all killing each other, and this is all bad. But it wasn't because of something called religion. There was no distinction to be made between religion and politics and economics and that sort of thing. And so when you begin to look at this period through that lens, then you begin to see that this idea that religion has this tendency to cause violence is just nonsense. It just doesn't help make sense of the facts on the ground. And the idea that the state stepped in to kind of keep the peace is equally ridiculous. If you begin to read these histories of the war, you find that one of the major causes of the wars was the rise of the state. So the attempt to kind of centralize authority over all the other kind of lesser authorities, the nobles and the guilds and the religious orders and the free cities and all of these kinds of things that made up the empire. And so almost the opposite is the case. The state doesn't step in to create peace, but the rise of the state is in many ways at the cause of the violence. So I wrote that article, and then much later in my book, The Myth of Religious Violence, I've got a whole chapter where I kind of go back and do a lot of the historical work that I just kind of briefly glanced at in the article. So the chapter 3 of Myth of Religious Violence is where I kind of work this out more systematically.
Yeah, and I have that book. It's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful expansion of a fire strong enough to consume the house. And one of the things, if I remember correctly, it's been years since I read both your article and then the book, but if I remember correctly, one of the aspects of your argument with regard to these wars being caused by the rise of the state, rather than caused by religion, is that the state begins to take on the coloration, the tone and tenor of the Christian churches, so that the states themselves become a kind of simulacrum of the church, a counterfeit church, in the sense that the state now provides its own protology, soteriology, eschatology, moral theology. And so, am I getting that right? I mean, is that a claim that you make someplace? Because I've got it rattling in my head that you did.
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways, you can ask, like, why does this distinction between religious and secular come about in this early modern period? And I think you look back, the history of the church since Constantine, and it's basically the struggle between ecclesiastical and civil authorities. And the early modern period is the period in which the civil authorities kind of get the upper hand once and for all.
Yeah.
And so religion then becomes what you confine the church to, while the secular then is everything else that the state is in charge of. And then it begins. So I borrow the term migrations of the holy. That's the name of another one of my books. I borrowed that from John Bossy, a historian, who kind of talks about how in this early modern period, the holy migrates from the church to the state, and the state begins to take on these divine pretensions. So you get the Sun King, Louis XIV, and so on. And he gives example after example. And since then, a lot of people have done a lot of work on this. There's interesting stuff about Elizabeth I appropriating Eucharistic rituals and imagery for the monarchy in Great Britain in that period as well. And so that, I think, really explains. So rather than secularization, the idea that the modern era is the emptying of the sacred out, or the pushing to the margins of the sacred, I think it's much more accurate to talk of this era as one in which the holy has migrated from the church to the nation state and to the market, especially, and other places as well. I really think, Jamie Smith is right. We are homo liturgicus. We are worshiping animals that will worship, something. And I mean, this has been said in many different ways. I think Chesterton said something like, when you stop believing in God, you'll believe in anything. Right.
Yeah. And wasn't it Chesterton who also said of America that America is a nation with the soul of a church? Yeah, and I think that is sort of accurately sort of portrays what it is you're saying here, as well as the notion of the holy simply migrated, and it also perhaps accounts for some of the degradation of our civilization, insofar as what migrated into the states became attenuated, if not distorted, because the state really is not a proper object of the sacred or of the holy.
Right. It's what Eugene McCarthy calls misenchantment. Right. He's got that great book on the enchantments of mammon, and he said we don't live in a disenchanted era. We live in a misenchanted era.
Well, this gets me to I was just going to bring up McCarthy. I was going to say, have you read McCarthy's great book? Because there were so many resonances when I was reading Field Hospital with that. Of course, Eugene McCarthy teaches at Villanova. Great book called The Enchantments of Mammon, which is now maybe 3 years old, 4 years old. I don't know. It's been out there a while. It's a great big thick book. You can spend a whole summer reading it, but it's well worth it. But he sort of rejects the sort of disenchantment thesis and says, look, no, we just, our enchantment simply moved from Christianity to, in his case, he would say, to the market. And as you correctly point out, you sent me an article on subsidiarity, which was really excellent. I read that this morning, and it's you kind of borrow from Pope Benedict's Deus Caritas in Veritate, in which he sort of points this out too, about the there used to be this binary of market and state, which was all consuming, but now market and state have come together sort of into confluence. So it's really, really hard to separate them. And I think this is kind of McCarthy's point too, as she goes through the history of the sort of enchantment of mammon, that it's now become this really centralized and united thing.
Right. Yeah. So the first chapter of a book that I'm working on now on idolatry is on Max Weber, and I actually go
Wow.
back and show that even Weber himself didn't really believe that the modern world was disenchanted. I mean, he uses that phrase a couple of times, but it's just widely scattered, and it wasn't in the first edition of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. But he also, in other places, talks about how many old gods ascend from their graves and take the form of impersonal forces. And so he's got this very troubled relationship. He can see that it's not capitalists, but it's capital that reigns, for example, and that war kind of takes on this war kind of out religions religion. And so he in some ways, puts forward this disenchantment thesis, but then takes it back. He really doesn't. So ultimately, I'm arguing that even Weber doesn't believe
Well,
this.
this is why I love you. You're the great slayer of these mythical dragons. The myth of religious freedom, and now the sort of myth of the Weberian disenchantment thesis that not even he was fully sold on. Because I just had a blog post I put up today, which was sort of on Augustine's two cities and idolatry. So I can't wait now to read your book when it comes out on idolatry, because I would actually. I would actually hold that in the modern era, and I can get your comment. There's so many things swimming in my head right now that I want to talk to you about, but that in the modern era, with the sort of end of confessional states, for better or for worse, that the proper role of the church in the world, maybe today and maybe it should have been as always, is really properly doxological, and because it is first and foremost a doxological liturgical reality. The church should be in the business of identifying and reversing idolatries. I found it very interesting in Field Hospital, for example, that when you were talking about Augustine and the City of God, that you correctly point out that Augustine doesn't really give us any kind of full-throated theory of the state, theory of religion, and how religion and the state should cooperate with one another. There's no massive theoretical apparatus to discuss that, even though he was over 100 years post Constantine, And this is very telling that instead he gives us a kind of performative history, a performative accounting of the history of the two cities and their interaction, which is in many, many ways the performative history of idolatry versus the church fighting that idolatry, or those who love God, the Amor Dei, fighting that idolatry. Anyway, is that a proper way of reading Augustine, do you think?
Oh yeah, I think that puts it really nicely, Larry. Yeah, I'm gonna steal that idea from you.
Feel
Yeah, I
free.
know the idea that I mean another chapter in this book that I'm writing on idolatry is on Augustine as well, and I think it's really I think it's really the case that uh, he puts forward this idea of two cities in time, but not kind of in space. I mean,
Right.
he doesn't think of this as a kind of the two cities as being kind of spatial divvying up of the world between the church and the state or something like this, but thinks of them as two performances. And in Migrations of the Holy, I talk about I use the analogy of the Strauss opera Ariadne auf Naxos, in which the richest man in Vienna is going to have he's throwing a big party, and he's going to have some entertainment in which there's going to be a tragedy on the stage followed by a comedy. And then he realizes that the fireworks have to start promptly at 9. So he says, look, you're going to have to do the tragedy and the comedy on the stage at the same time. And so you've
Yeah.
got this kind of, Ariadne mourning her lost lover and waiting for death. And then this troupe of comedians and harlequins and buffoons come on, and they divert the action into a comedy rather than a tragedy. And that's what I think the church's role is. We're not on a separate stage We're
Right.
on the same stage of history, but what we're meant to do, and I think the way you put it, like do this liturgically, doxologically, I think that's exactly right. But we're meant to kind of divert the action of history into a comedy from the tragedy that's being performed now. So two different kind of intermingled troops of players, but one historical stage on which we're acting.
Yeah, that leads to something that we were talking about before earlier, which is the definition of religion. In Field Hospital, you talk a great deal about perhaps the best way forward in trying to define religion is to approach it through a functionalist definition rather than a more substantive definition, metaphysical definition, where it's sort of reified and essentialized into this thing, that it's rather a performative thing. Now, a functionalist thing. That then leads, I mean, we've all had these conversations with modern atheists, agnostics, the Christopher Hitchens types and people that read Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. And, they buy into this mythology that religion causes violence, to which, typical interlocutor, like an idiot like myself, would say, well, what about all of the wars of secularity from Napoleon on forward? All of, the past 300 years, almost all of the great wars have been secular wars fought by secular states for secular reasons. And their response is always, oh, no, no, no. Fascism, communism, all of the nationalism, all of those isms are really religious movements in their core. And therefore, it's still a kind of religion, so to speak. But then that opens up a can of worms that they're not willing to address, which is, if you're going to have a separation of church and state, according to the how does then one go about adjudicating the separation of all of that then from government? I mean, now you've got to start parsing where even states are acting religiously, even if they appear to be acting secularly, and say, no, we got to delegitimate that because that's religion too. Anyway, what do you think about? I mean, I know you talk about that functionalist approach to religion and state power.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for Hitchens, the distinction between religious and secular is basically the distinction between things that Hitchens doesn't like and things that Hitchens likes. Right? I mean,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
it's a really malleable definition. So yeah, so he says that Martin Luther King was not really a Christian because he was nonviolent, and at the same time, Stalin was really religious, even though he's an atheist. So you just whatever he doesn't. So this line is really malleable. So part of the problem with functionalism is that you still want to end up with a definition of religion as opposed to the secular. You just expand it and make it really big. So I wouldn't call myself either a substantivist or a functionalist. I would put myself in the constructivist camp, where basically the distinction between religious and secular is just this really malleable thing that gets constructed in all sorts of different ways for different reasons of power, and that we always need to ask kind of, what does the term mean under these circumstances, and why is this distinction being used? So there might be a few, benign uses of the religious secular distinction, one of which is it allows religious studies departments to happen at universities where they otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah.
I was giving a talk one time, and a guy who taught at the University of Virginia came up and said, "Would you knock it off? You're going to, I'm going to be out of a job."
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, great. So you've got theology being taught at Thomas Jefferson's University because of this distinction between religious and secular. So it's like, okay, under those circumstances, great. But usually this distinction is doing damage.
Yeah.
So I tend to always kind of want to examine what exactly it means.
Reminds me of my dissertation director, the late, great Father Edward Oakes, who, when I was doing my dissertation at Fordham, he was a professor at NYU. And he of course, was teaching courses on Christianity, Catholicism, religion, but it all had to be done in the Department of Near Eastern Languages. So because there was no major department of religion, so yeah, you can always find a way to talk about it in whatever way you're going to designate it. But you already anticipated something I wanted to ask you, which is that when I was reading Field Hospital, you made use of functionalist understandings of religion, but it was very clear that you didn't simply come out and say, and that's the way to approach the definition of religion. You
Right.
thought that the functionalist thing had some merit to it, but it was so I was going to ask you, okay, if you're not a strictly speaking a functionalist, what are you? And so constructivist. So you've already answered my question, and I think that I would agree. I think that's the most fruitful way forward. But I would also, I mean, along these lines then of defining religion, you bring up in your book too the mandate in Obamacare, what came to be known as sort of the contraception mandate in Obamacare that said that you have to have coverage of contraception in your healthcare plans, even if you're, an ostensibly religious organization. Of course, this is like 10 years ago now or whenever it was, and there was a big brouhaha, and the church has fought it on grounds of religious freedom and religious liberty. And that was something that you also had a certain caveat about, which we get into. But what was interesting was that the Obamacare mandate said, well, you don't have to have it in your insurance plan if this plan covers people that actually work in your church, in the worship part of your church. But insofar as the church has hospitals or universities or daycare centers that are run under the auspices of the church, but still, those are secular endeavors, and therefore they have to provide contraception for their employees. And that speaks to a certain vision of here's the government, in a sense, defining what religion is and is not for the purposes of a policy mandate. So maybe you could talk about that in the broader context too of how religion came to be defined as this very limited thing for the purposes of sort of domesticating it.
Yeah, and in some ways it's our own fault, right? So the way they define it is religion is what goes on in religion classes, but it's not what's going on in your, government classes at a Catholic school or your economics classes in a Catholic school or whatever. And in part that's a failing of Catholic schools, right?
Oh yeah.
Because my kids, that all went through Catholic schools, they're using the same, geography textbooks and political science textbooks and, so on as the kids in the public schools, right? It's only in religion class that they get something different. And so in one of the, I think it's in one of the chapters in Field Hospital, I talk about I found an old Catholic geography textbook from a Catholic school in my aunt and uncle's bedroom while I was staying with them. It was from 1952, and it was this incredible, teaching grade school kids about the just price and how letting prices be set by supply and demand was unjust. And all of these, presentation of these communities where people are integrating their Catholicism with their economic practices and so on. And that we just don't do that anymore. So there was this whole kind of Catholic economic vision in this grade school textbook that now is gone. And so in a lot of ways, it's our own fault that we have kind of made these distinctions and kind of cordoned off Catholicism into religion class, and then doing this.
Oh, that is so true. Or if it's not, if it is cordoned off, and then the secular disciplines go their merry way. But some Catholic schools, like my former employer, DeSales University, did at least try to toss what Bill Portier calls Jesus sprinkles on top of the whole thing to make it look good.
Right? Yeah.
So I'm reminded of the fact that DeSales built this magnificent $20-30 million brand new business and health sciences building. And one of their crown jewels, it also has the sort of business department on the second floor. One of the crown jewels is this big room with glass windows that's a sort of mock stock exchange. and you can see the sort of Wall Street stock sticker electronic ribbon on the top. But above that electronic stock ribbon ticker is a crucifix. And I turned to my colleague Rodney Hauser the first time I saw this, and I said, dude, that strikes me as almost blasphemous or sacrilegious, but maybe I'm just being a curmudgeon. I don't know, because my gut was, and I don't know this to be absolute fact, but knowing the business faculty, my gut told me that there was nothing from Catholic social teaching that was being taught in our economics, business, marketing courses, probably nothing. And that everything that was being taught was probably textbook that could have been taught at Harvard, or any of those other places.
Yeah.
And so that does, I think, speak to a huge problem where we have been complicit in our own domestication and our own marginalization, insofar as we run our own institutions and establishments in almost exactly the way that the state sort of wants us to be these little cordoned off things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't know if you know Mary Hirschfeld at Villanova, but she has a PhD in economics from Harvard. She taught economics for 15 years, realized that there was all this kind of surreptitious theological anthropology going on in mainstream economics. And so she got a PhD in theology at Notre Dame. And now she teaches at Villanova. She's got a great book called Aquinas and the Market, where she kind of...
I've seen that book.
Yeah, you ought to take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. She unearths the kind of surreptitious metaphysics and anthropology underneath modern economics. So now she teaches, she has a PhD in economics. She still loves economics, but she's in the humanities department at Villanova because she's not welcome in the economics department anymore, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you who also teaches at Villanova and probably is not welcome in the economics department is Eugene McCarthy,
right,
who we were just speaking.
Yeah.
Because in the first parts of his book, there were tears. Only a sort of academic nerd would weep tears of joy when they were reading a book like McCarthy's. But he really lampoons, satirizes, even goes after economics.
He's a great writer. He's very fun.
I mean, he essentially says that economics is the biggest, most bogus academic discipline that there is. And I'm not, I don't know economics, so I can't adjudicate that. I cannot, but it just spoke to my contrarian soul, and my soul that just instinctively does not like capitalism. I am, after all, a Catholic worker. And so, I mean, I don't know if he's right about that or wrong about that, but it was just beautiful in my mind. But speaking of Catholic worker, well, let's shift gears here a little bit. You mentioned, I mean, because it's sort of my thesis following a lot of other people's theses, and Dorothy Day as well, that the movement, and James Matthew Wilson, the poet, once pointed this out to me too. He's the movement of all of modernity is towards greater and greater centralization. Mm-hmm. That's I mean, you can't sort of encapsulate modernity in just one thing, but that's certainly a real hard aspect. One of the essential markers of modernity is this movement towards centralization. And so, as I like to point out to people, I had a blog post on what does Dorothy Day mean when she says she's an anarchist. Doesn't mean she's an antinomian libertarian, an anarcho-capitalist, or something like that. It really is a politics of anti-centralization. It's, I guess you would call it distributist, localist, whatever you want to call it. And that's, going to people like Schumacher, Small is Beautiful and stuff. So you mentioned Pope Benedict's encyclical many times, Caritas in Veritate. And you mentioned that he appeals to what he calls dispersed political authority as perhaps the model that we should be shooting for here. And that you say that this has resonances with some of the early 20th century distributists, English pluralists. I'm not even certain what the difference is between a distributist and an English pluralist, but maybe you can unpack that a little bit. What do we mean by this dispersed political authority? And is it even realistic in our time to even think that this might be possible?
Yeah, so the difference, I think, is that the distributists thought in terms of the distribution of private property as widely as possible. The Chesterton
Right.
deal was the kind of individual shopkeeper and so on. The pluralists, like John Neville Figgis, is the one figure, great kind of Anglican cleric and really perceptive writer on this stuff. But the pluralists, and there were a few others.
Well, let me interrupt you for a second. The article
Yeah.
you sent me today mentions Figgis, and so I was wondering if he was one of the pluralists you were talking about. I think you mentioned that in there. So yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Who mentions Figgis?
You do in the article you sent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I thought you said Dorothy Day. That would be interesting.
No,
But,
no.
but same sort of spirit, right? So concerned about the centralization, and a pluralist thinks that rather than the state being kind of the apex of this pyramid of power, that instead the most natural communities are the communities of like at the local level. So associations of workers, unions, churches, fraternal organizations, all those kinds of associations are not just intermediate associations between the state and the individual, but are the most natural kind of human association at the state. And the state should only exist in order to kind of coordinate these organizations. And the state does not give them power by recognition, but rather the state is kind of created as a very sort of limited kind of coordinating agency by these more natural communities. And
Yeah.
I think that in some ways, so what I was arguing in that article that I sent you, it was from a volume on Figgis. I think in some ways he's got a better understanding of this dynamic than some Catholic social teaching does, where we've gone in the direction of subsidiarity, which tends to mean that which has a lot of things in common and is generally good, but somebody's got to decide at what level things should be addressed. Subsidiarity says you're supposed to address things at the lowest level possible, but somebody's got to decide who's going to
Exactly.
at what level it belongs. And it always ends up being the state or the EU, right? The subsidiarity was borrowed by the EU from Catholic social teaching and is part of there. But they continue to kind of centralize power in Brussels. And so that's part of the problem, is that whoever's at the top is then kind of making the decisions about at what level things ought to be addressed.
Right.
Whereas Figgis thinks that the more natural kind of organic communities are where the decision making should lie. How that works exactly is not clear, and I'm afraid of giving aid and comfort to the kind of corporate interests that want to diminish the power of the state so that the corporation can rule. But as you said before, the corporation and the state are really one these days. They've got their interests are so fused.
That comes out clearly. And so, are you familiar with Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism?
Yeah.
I mean, that details beautifully this coming together, this confluence of big tech and government, so that the two are almost becoming indistinguishable from each other.
Right.
But we can go.
She talks about the kind of new version of primitive accumulation is the kind of mining of our lives for data, kind of, as primitive accumulation used to mean the kind of enclosure of common lands and the colonization of land. But now the latest version is our lives are being colonized. Our lives are being used as kind of, virgin land and raw material by the corporations that are kind of, mining our data in order to sell our data to advertisers. Right. We can be targeted better. Yeah, really interesting book.
It's an interesting book, but I'm going to come back to subsidiarity because it reminds me when you were talking about, you're a little bit suspicious of where it's basically the state which is deciding, what the various levels, what level of authority they're going to have. A couple of points. Number one, it reminds I don't know if you're familiar with David C. Schindler's recent book, The Politics of the Real.
Haven't read it, no.
Yeah, it's a great book. Hauser and I interviewed he and Mike Hanby not too long ago on this topic. But what's interesting is he makes the same point, that the only limitations on the state's power these days comes from the state itself. It's a kind of self limitation, that there are no more constitutive and more aboriginal natural authorities recognized in society that inherently have an authority that is not that of the state and is prior to the state in a sense, metaphysically, and that a proper sense of subsidiarity, and it sounds like sort of Figgis would be arguing for this in his pluralist model, a proper sense of subsidiarity would in a sense want to recognize these non-state entities within a culture, within a society that have a natural authority in and of themselves that the state cannot abrogate. And that is a better sense of what the Catholic Church has historically meant by subsidiarity. And because that, like you said, a lot of Catholics misunderstand. I think in Field Hospital, you talk about Brian Hare's discussion of subsidiarity, and he ends up essentially justifying sort of big state solutions to everything based on subsidiarity. Precisely, well, it's just procedural, and once we have determined that in a huge, complex country like America, that local entities just can't do these XYZ, well, then, of course, the big government's got to do all of this. And it's actually a violation of subsidiarity to keep insisting that all these lower entities should be doing these things. Right. And so he has a very procedural view of subsidiarity that doesn't recognize that subsidiarity is rooted in these natural pre-state constitutive sort of realities and authorities. And he, too, buys into the idea that subsidiarity is just something that the state has to, in a procedural way, adjudicate for all of us. And I just don't, I think you correctly sort of go after that view in the book and argue for some of these other ideas.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, whenever an idea is so flexible that it can be embraced by both sides of an issue, then something is wrong. I give some examples in that article of how Catholics on both sides of the Brexit debate were invoking subsidiarity.
Yeah.
It's embraced by George W. Bush. It's embraced by the bureaucracy of the EU and so on. So it really makes you wonder. I wonder, Larry, if you have read much of Ivan Ilitch.
I have, and I love him.
He's amazing.
He is amazing. I came to him late in life, just literally like a couple years ago, when a friend of mine who runs a Catholic worker house out in Minnesota now, Colin Miller, turned me on to him, and I just think he's phenomenal.
There's a new book out by David Cayley, which is the best book. It's this comprehensive reading of Ilitch. I think it's just called I think it's called Ivan Ilitch, Intellectual Journey or something like that. But the name of the book is just Ivan Ilitch, but it's by David Cayley, who had a tremendous program on Canadian public radio for years. Best interviewer I've ever seen. But
okay, well, for the sake of my viewers, spell Cayley so that they can look it up on Amazon.
Cayley. David
Okay.
Cayley, and the book is just called Ivan Ilitch.
Yeah, because I would like to. I can't recommend even Ivan Ilitch's books and writings like more highly, and this would be a great entryway in, because it would be a piece of secondary literature that really captures him.
Absolutely, and it's so well done. Cayley knew Ilitch really well and has a couple of books of interviews with Ilitch that are out there. So he's kind of the authority on Ilitch, and he has all the right instincts. But one of the things that Ilitch talks about is the war on subsistence. And he kind of reads modernity as this constant attempt to take away people's ability to make a life for themselves and hand it over to experts of one kind or another. And his books can kind of be read through that lens, the way that we delegate our bodies to the medical establishment and the way we, delegate much of our lives to the state and so on. And so he's really, he doesn't romanticize poverty, subsistence is kind of a dirty word, but what he means by subsistence and by what he calls vernacular culture is just the ability of people in small communities to make a life for themselves, which is not dictated to them, from elsewhere. And so, and he talks about the history, the corruption of the best is the worst, he says. He was a very devout Catholic to the end of his life. He was had been kind of had put his priest.
He was an ex-priest, yeah.
Yeah, he was never an ex-priest. Actually, his faculties were never taken away from him. He just suspended his active ministry when the Vatican kind of cracked.
But he was never laicized.
Right. Yeah. And so he talks about his reading of the Good Samaritan story is really interesting, because he talks about the way that we tend to read that story is that your neighbor is everybody, right? And so the obligation to care for others then becomes kind of universalized and standardized and bureaucratized, to where you get to the point where Ramsey is making an argument that you can kind of defend the Jericho Road with an army in order, this is the Good Samaritan response, a kind of just war argument. And Ilitch says that the real way to read the Good Samaritan is not that the neighbor is everybody, it's that the neighbor is anybody. It's anybody that Providence throws into your path. And it's this immediate kind of, the Greek in the text says that the Samaritan was moved in his bowels. He was just kind of moved with pity in his bowels. And so it's just like flesh calling out to flesh in this really immediate sort of way. And the problem is that we've taken that and kind of institutionalized it and bureaucratized it. And that, I think, is exactly what the Catholic worker movement is trying to kind of undo, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say it was one of Dorothy Day's biggest issues was the bureaucratization of charity to the point where it wasn't even charity anymore, because it wasn't on that personal level. It wasn't visceral. It wasn't person to person. And she feared that the state was simply going to continue to take more and more and more of that away and take it unto himself, so that then people don't have to be charitable anymore. Which brings me, then to another point, which is, okay, so an argument that I often run into from my well-meaning fellow Christian friends who are big believers in socialism or big statism, whatever you want to call it, but they have no problem. In other words, they don't have my problems with the Leviathan of the modern state, as I call it. They would argue that our society has gotten so huge and so complex, and the world so global and interconnected technologically, economically, and so on, as well as some of the environmental disasters that might be looming on our horizon that require transnational cooperation, all of that argues for an even greater movement towards centralization, perhaps even a kind of some sort of UN-like authority that has more authority than the UN over member states. And that's all necessary given the dynamics of modern economics, politics, environmental problems, and so on. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, well, there's something kind of tautologous about that argument to begin with, right? Things are so interconnected and centralized that things have to be so interconnected and centralized,
Exactly.
So,
that's exactly, I don't use the word tautology, but that's exactly what I said. We'll talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. So, I think you need to make distinctions, and you can't just say small is beautiful. And even Ilitch, talked about the necessity of, cooperation across geographical boundaries and so on. And that's clearly necessary in the case of a kind of transnational disaster like the environmental crisis. But kind of trans-geographical cooperation does not necessarily have to imply the centralization of authority.
Right.
I think
Right.
those kind of things need to be pried apart. The assumption that one goes with the other, and people's social teaching is not real clear on this. In Caritas and Veritate, you've got this. On the one hand, Pope Benedict talking about dispersed political authority, and then several paragraphs later, he's talking about kind of world government, and so I think
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, and Pope Francis does the same kind of thing, and I think they're kind of reaching for solutions that are both below and above the nation state, and I think that's kind of positive. But the idea of kind of centralized world government just sounds like really.
I like
really
how, I like how you put it just then, that they're aiming for something above and below the current nature of nation state relations, because that was my reaction as I was reading your book and realized, Benedict does, in a sense, seems like he contradicts himself here. One sense talking about dispersed political authority, then in the next breath something about a world government authority or something or other. But I think you're right. I think it's the modern papacy trying to take Catholic social teaching, bring it to bear on the current status of the modern nation states, and saying there's something deeply wrong with how we are construing governments these days, and something has to be done about it.
Now, I mean, and so if you look at Dorothy Day, I think she's got a sense that we certainly need to cooperate, but cooperation can't be coerced, right? And
yes,
so
right.
we have these forms of kind of international cooperation, but what people want to add to that is, but it's got to have real teeth. You got to be able to force people to do that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I just don't think that's going to happen. I mean, ultimately, it's going to happen not because people are forced by a world government that has power over everybody on the face of the planet, but they're going to cooperate because they want to for whatever reason, and you can't kind of coerce the sort of virtue that's going to be necessary to get out of the current situation. It's really just going to take a whole different way of living and relating to the planet, and I think that's what Laudato Si articulates so beautifully.
As I often say to people, I personally, I tend to be rather dystopian in my view of the future. As I've said in numerous videos of mine, I'm not a glass half full or glass half empty guy. I'm a, do we have a glass? You have a glass? I'm that kind of a guy. So I don't know if my tendency to think in dystopian ways is simply part of my general curmudgeonly disposition, or whether it's an accurate assessment. I tend to think that it's an accurate assessment. I tend to have a more dystopian view of the future, but with not necessarily a view that views it as in vernacular apocalyptic zombie apocalypse kind of violent ways necessarily. As I say, it might just be Huxley's Brave New World with a Disney World aesthetic, or because family values, whatever. So, I mean, what is your vision for the future? And I want to come back to another concept about inverted totalitarianism. But what is Bill Cavanaugh's vision of the future, just as a person?
Oh boy, I mean, it depends if you're talking kind of normatively or descriptively, I guess, or maybe I would just want to make the distinction between optimism and hope, right?
Right.
I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful because I've been ordered to be hopeful, right? I mean, it's a duty of Christianity to be hopeful, right? I mean, hope is one of the three theological virtues, and we are obliged to hope, and so and so what that means is you kind of although you look at the world, look at Ukraine and so on, what's going on today, and things don't look good, right?
Right.
So I would never kind of make a rosy prediction about the future, but I will say that it's in God's hands, and if we're really who we say we are as Christians, then we need to put things in God's hands and hope that ultimately the story of the universe is a comedy and not a tragedy, right? And I think
No,
we're
exactly.
kind of obliged to do that, and part of what makes the world the way it is now, the way it appears to be, is that we think that God is not going to do anything, so we have to, right? We think that we have to be in charge,
Right.
we fix the world. And so we've got to rush lots of weapons to Ukraine, for example, because it wouldn't do to, mount a kind of nonviolent approach. And in that ways, we oftentimes make the world worse, both in the short run and in the long run. So hope, but not optimism.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great because that's why I raised the question here because, like as David C. Schindler once said to me, he goes, part of the problem with modern liberalism is that it is so sort of hegemonically in control of things. It's even in control of our imaginations, so that it robs us of the ability to even imagine what could be different. And I always like to remember that because the fact is we have this very limited sense of imaginative possibilities before us precisely because our imagination has been attenuated for us, truncated for us. And therefore, the hope part really appeals to me because as a Christian, I'd say, well, people say to me, okay, Mr. Curmudgeon Smarty Pants, what's your answer to all of this sort of stuff? And I say, I don't have an answer, but God does. And I'm convinced that if we but remain faithful to the gospel, if we pursue the path of holiness, remain faithful to Christ, that God's going to show us the way. There's going to be eventually a light at the end of the tunnel. What will a post-liberal order look like? I don't know. But when it gets here, we'll see it, and we'll sort of recognize it for what it is. And it doesn't mean we can't work towards it in certain very small but significant ways. And one of the things that you just brought up, too, was the sort of nobody even considers nonviolent resistance, these days, as a Catholic worker. And you talk about this like in your book, Field Hospital. I just posted a blog post today that talks about what I call America's nuclear onanism, which is where we're in our moral theology, we're very good at identifying, immoral, onanistic, sexual immoralities and so forth. You got to go to confession for that. But we're very bad at identifying the fact that something as horrific as mutually assured destruction, and there are Catholics sitting in nuclear silos right now with a launch turnkey ready to go and incinerate 10 million people, that's not something you got to confess. And there's no that's parvati of matter there. That's not objectively immoral. That's a prudential judgment. But God help us in these other moral theological domains where that's a mortal sin and you got to go to confession for that. And there's such an asymmetry in our moral theology. That's why I called the post, Augustine's Two Cities or something on our nuclear onanism, that we just here we have this massive evil staring us in the face, and we've sort of punted as a church in terms of confronting the evil of the nuclear deterrence and the militarism in general. And then, of course, our answer, now I'm on a little soapbox now, but our answer to everything is, well, let's just send somebody more Stinger missiles. That's clearly the answer right there. Just more Stinger missiles. Anyway, what are your thoughts on the whole? I know your thoughts sort of on pacifism and nonviolence. I read them, but maybe share them with our viewers.
Yeah.
Maybe it's so that I don't appear like a complete raving nut job. So maybe.
Well, I mean, as far as nuclear deterrence, it was interesting. When the challenge of peace came out from the Catholic bishops, U.S. Catholic bishops in 1983.
Yeah.
There was debate about whether or not to condemn nuclear deterrence outright, and the compromise that was made was to say nuclear deterrence is unacceptable, but in the short run, we might have
Yeah,
to hold on. But we should be taking steps towards dismantling it. And now it's 40 years later, and there's no, so you just kind of keep putting it off into the distance. But the question of nonviolence with Ukraine is interesting because there's actually been some Catholics who have said, aha, this is a vindication of the just war idea. If ever there was a just war, certainly the
right.
Ukrainians are, are entitled to defend themselves and so on against this aggression. And we'll see how this plays out. And I find myself in, dark places in my soul, kind of rooting for the armed resistance in Ukraine,
Right.
and so on. And
I think we all are. Yeah, we all are.
and I wouldn't, condemn anybody for, taking up it's a luxury that sitting here in Chicago, it would be ridiculous for me to condemn anybody for taking up arms in the Ukraine. And we'll see how it works out. But here's one possible scenario of how it's going to work out in the Ukraine. And the possible scenario is Russia is just much bigger and much more powerful, and eventually they wear down the resistance and occupy the country. And after tremendous loss of life and devastation of Ukraine, then people begin to resist the way that they've already started to resist in some ways, which is non-compliance and non-violently refusing to be governed by the Russians. So imagine the scenario in which you just cut to the chase, and instead of going through months of this incredible devastation, you start your nonviolent resistance right from the start, and render the country ungovernable, to show the world what a Christian country looks like, and to render it ungovernable, and without all of the without wrecking the country as is currently happening, and without the displacement of 10 million people and the tens of thousands of deaths and so on. And that's a possibility that people don't even contemplate.
Yeah, they don't even consider it. Yeah,
talking about this war in Christian terms are people like Putin and Patriarch Kirill, who have been, whose Christianity has been so corrupted by nationalism that, but at least they're talking about this war in Christian terms. I'd like to see some more people talk about this war in Christian terms, and about the possibilities of responding in a way that is faithful to the Sermon on the Mount. But you just don't hear it.
I mean, I would add to that, but I can't add anything better to that, because I think you've just articulated my own point of view as well as a Catholic worker. I certainly wouldn't condemn anybody who wants to take up arms and defend their land, their homeland, against what is clearly an unjust, aggressive invasion. It's not my place to judge that. But like you, I'm just sitting here thinking, well, it doesn't seem like anybody has considered the path of Christian nonviolent resistance, which might actually have a great deal of public purchase in the sort of war of information, since we're talking about essentially two deeply, historically Christian nations who share, for the most part, a common Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox faith. And therefore, that might actually end up having some traction in a way that Stinger missiles and anti-tank missiles and stuff won't. And you end up with a nation of nothing but rubble and bitterness and animosity governed by tanks, when it maybe is you could do another path. But anyway, I'm no expert on geopolitical affairs, but I just tossed that out there. Before we're sort of running out of time. But before we get out of here, I do want to talk about another idea in your book, Field Hospital, which is you talk about the fact, that modern liberalism, whatever we want to call it, is sort of latently totalitarian. But this really struck me, because it echoes a thought that I've had in my brain. I think you're quoting Smolin, and you say that modern totalitarianism, however, is not, in a sense, a totalitarianism of gathering in everything in society into the bosom of the state, which will now control it from above. But it's actually a totalitarianism that, in a sense, takes control of everything by scattering it. So he calls it an inverted totalitarianism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's an idea. That's from Sheldon Wolin. And
Wolin, yeah,
secular Jew, but very appreciative of kind of Christian history, and he talks about the way that it's not a matter of trying to get everybody to kind of zusammen marschieren is what the Nazis talked about, everybody marching together, but it's more the kind of depoliticization of people. Go home and watch TV and let us run things. And that's the kind of, I mean, in some ways, that's what was going on in Chile under the Pinochet regime as well, that it's not fascism. It's the opposite of fascism, where, Milton Friedman is the architect. So you need to impose it, by military rule to start with. But the basic idea is to atomize the body politic, to individualize people. So Wolin talks about how the citizen is reduced to the voter, periodically courted and confused and, scared into voting every, 4 years or something, but otherwise completely marginalized from any kind of exercise of power, and boy, that just really seems to describe where we're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, like Dorothy Day did not vote, and for largely the same reasons, because she just thought that it was to be complicit in a set of illusions that perpetuates the system of illusions. That okay, I get to vote every 4 years for the lesser evil of 2 presidential candidates, and there I've done my civic duty. As the Boy Scout manual says, and I've done my Christian duty now. I can wash my hands of it, and so on. But it's all deeply mendacious, it seems to me, and so and it doesn't speak well to our process. But that brings me then to my sort of last point that I want to talk about, which is I think there's a chapter in your book you call "Can I Be Free Not to Be Religious?" or something. In other words, what you're arguing for is that for the church to be constantly appealing to American constitutional principles of religious liberty and freedom might in some ways be counterproductive. And I think that's a very interesting idea. So maybe you could talk about that here at the end.
Yeah. Are we free not to be a religion? And I pull on some of Tissa Wenger's work she teaches at Yale, and she does some really interesting work on the Pueblo Indians in the 1920s.
Right.
And
that was great, by the way. It's worth the price of this book, that whole section on the Pueblo Indians. It was fascinating. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and thanks to Tissa. I mean, it's her work. It's really interesting. But she looks at the way there was no such thing as religion in Pueblo Indian society, as in many Indian tribes, right? Religion was not this separate thing, from the rest of life. It was, there just was no such thing. So they didn't even have a word for it. But the government comes in and tries to shut down their dances, which they say are counterproductive, and they're against the assimilation of the Indians into American society. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs tries to shut them down. So some white lawyers who are sympathetic to the Pueblo say, appeal to the principle of religious freedom. And so they do, to protect their dances. But once they do that, then people in the tribe start invoking the principle of religious freedom to not participate in this very important and central ritual of the tribe. And so it in similar ways, so then I talk about, Catholics invoking this principle of religious liberty. It might in some circumstances buy you some freedom, but it's a two-edged sword. And one of the things it does is it individualizes the community. And another thing, by defining religion as essentially, and I look at some of the jurisprudence on this, defining religion essentially as what's in the individual's heart, whatever the individual believes.
Right.
It also accelerates the assimilation of the community to the larger, American
Yeah.
object, American society. So making some arguments there that we have to be really careful once we've defined ourselves. Once we've defined Catholicism as a religion, then we've already lost the battle.
Yeah. Then it becomes simply atomized individuals as far as the state is concerned, and the church viewed, and D.C. Schindler makes this point in his book, The Politics of the Real. The church viewed as the incarnational embodiment, of Christ, then as a society down and through history, is utterly marginalized at that point in society. It'd be one of those sort of natural authorities I was talking about before. But anyway, we're sort of we're out of time. I don't like these things to go on too. I don't want to tax people's patience too much. I could talk to you, Bill, for hours. This has just been fantastic. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy, and coming on to do this. And I mean, do you have any last words for viewers or any?
Yeah, just thanks, Larry. I hope we do get the opportunity to sit over a beer and talk sometime again. This has been really fun.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm going to now sort of stop this and stop session, stop record.